Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another fresh episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Houston's Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm again joined by Paulo Alves, my co-host and producer out of Portugal. You can follow him on social media at Paulo Alves NBA and me at Ben Dubose. So, on this Friday, July 11th, the NBA's 2025 Summer League is officially underway out in Las Vegas. The Rockets' first game is late tonight against the LA Clippers. The summer roster for Houston is basically the Reed Sheppard showcase because the Rockets are suddenly in contending mode. The Summer League squad isn't nearly as loaded in terms of good prospects relative to the rebuilding years of a few years ago. That's just the nature of team building in the NBA and how the cycle goes. So on today's show, we will talk a bit before we close up shop about Reed Sheppard and the Summer League squad. Rafael Stone, GM of the Rockets, said the other day that the Rockets have Reed penciled in for a big role during the upcoming season. Clearly, they're counting on him. So certainly how he performs. It's not that we're going to extrapolate anything great or terrible from Summer League, but it's something to watch for. And in that same press conference, Rafael also talked about some of the transactions from this offseason that are finally official. The NBA's moratorium was lifted earlier this week, so there's been a wave of announcements and press releases all over the league, which allows teams and players to officially comment on these deals for the first time, like Kevin Durant here in Houston. Rafael had some interesting things to say about that, and really a number of topics from the busy 2025 offseason, including what not to expect over the remainder of the offseason. Spoiler, they're probably done, and we'll explain why on today's show. And generally, we'll react to his quotes from that press conference on Monday afternoon. But I'm going to start our discussion today by looking at the one transaction that was not known when we last recorded an episode back on July 2nd, and that's the Cam Whitmore trade that went down last weekend. The Rockets are sending him to Washington for 2 unprotected second-round draft picks, one from Chicago in 2026 and the other from Sacramento in 2029. And we can get into what Rafael said in a few minutes as far as the rationalization for the deal. Rafael mentioned that they're not a developmental team anymore. But I want to start by looking at this from an asset perspective, and then we can talk about the basketball side of things later. From an asset perspective and looking at what they sent out and what they got, Paulo, I think this is a pretty reasonable deal. I think Cam Whitmore, while you shouldn't think that he's a bust, he's had flashes his first couple of years. At the same time, he also hasn't clearly taken a step forward to where you would conclude that he's clearly going to be a good starter or even rotation player on a winning team in the NBA. He certainly can be. He just hasn't proven that yet. And some of that's due to circumstances beyond his control with how deep and how good the current Rockets are. But regardless, he has not proven it yet. And he's a guy who was at number 20 2 years ago. And perhaps that's not for basketball reasons. Perhaps that's for off-court concerns. Whatever the case, he was number 20 pick 2 years ago. And while I don't think his value has declined since then, at least from a basketball standpoint, there's no reason you should be lower on him. There's also not a clear reason that you should be higher. And what's changed between now and then is that in 2023, like any first-round prospect, you have up to 4 years of cheap rookie scale labor. And that gives you a lot of buffer, a lot of wiggle room to decide what the future is going to look like, to evaluate how he fits in. Now there's only 2 years of that 4-year deal left, and he's extension eligible after this coming season. So basically, the same risk profile for Washington is there in 2025 with Cam Whitmore that was there for Houston in 2023. But unlike the Rockets, who got 4 years of rookie scale labor out of Cam Whitmore, or theoretically 4 years, the Wizards are only getting a maximum of 2. So because of that, even if the prospect is still the same, and Cam is just 21 years old, one of the youngest guys in this draft class. At the same time, because the contract is different, he's probably not going to be worth the same value now on the open market that he was 2 years ago. And that's why a guy who went number 20 in the 2023 first round is suddenly worth a couple of second round picks this year. I think a slight decline is reasonable, and I think Rafael Stone did relatively well. The 2 picks they got from the Bulls and the Kings, these are non-playoff teams, no stars. In the case of the Kings, they play in a deep Western Conference and in one of the smallest markets in the NBA. In the case of the Bulls, they aren't managed particularly well and have not been for some time. So these are not end of the second round picks that are basically the same as undrafted free agents, like one of the ones they sent to Phoenix in the Kevin Durant deal, that Mr. Irrelevant pick from Oklahoma City this year that was literally the last pick in the draft. No, these are quality second round picks. And another value point I think is worth noting when we assess the job Rafael Stone did in getting this deal. It's been reported that Cam Whitmore nearly went to the Suns in the KD trade. Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype reported that. I've heard it myself. The Suns actually opted for the 5 second round picks. Now you might say, well, why are they getting 5 and the Rockets then only got 2 if the Suns were comparing the options? Well, it's because the 5 they got, many of them were like that OKC pick at number 59 this year, not good ones, or future picks from the Rockets and the Celtics who are set up really well. And what ended up happening is the Suns basically consolidated those second round assets and traded up for 2 picks, I think, in the top 10 of the second round this year. And I think basically the Suns viewed those future seconds from the Rockets as having more liquidity. And so they could go out and bring in rookies that they could basically mold in-house. And they viewed that as being preferable to Cam Whitmore, especially for a team that already has so many shooting guards, Devin Booker, Jalen Green, and I guess for the moment, they still have Bradley Beal as well. So when you look at the reports of the Rockets-Suns negotiations, it was pretty clear that Cam Whitmore's value was roughly in line with a few second-round picks. I think the deal the Rockets got, they got 2 second-round picks, but these are quality second-round picks. And so all in all, I think Rafael Stone did a pretty good job if you want to look at it through the prism of hashtag asset management. Now, in terms of basketball, yeah, it's absolutely possible that Cam Whitmore could still turn into a very good NBA player. And so we'll talk about that side of the fence in a few minutes. But just looking at the job they did negotiating, it's not a sexy deal, but look, you lost some second round picks in the deal for KD. You brought in 2 pretty good ones. You have all sorts of optionality when it comes to contracts and the future iterations of your roster, how those can fit in, including that pick next year from the Bulls, the 1 year in 2026 that you currently do not have a first round pick. So all in all, I think the Rockets did a pretty good job. Paolo, what did you think of it strictly from the asset side of the fence and the job Rafael Stone did in negotiating this deal and ultimately sending Cam Whitmore to a place where, you know, if nothing else, it should buy him goodwill with Cam and his agent. Cam's a Maryland native. He goes to D.C., so he's close to home. It's a bad team, so he'll get to play. He should have opportunities. I think the Rockets did relatively well in terms of, you know, dealing with a difficult hand that they were dealt.
Yeah, I think you laid out pretty well why, from a value perspective, it was what it was. But I actually think it was mostly because of the other side of things. So first of all, I actually think compared to when he was drafted, which was, let's say, at the time he was drafted, his value was pick 20 in the draft. I do agree. Obviously, you lose value because you have less of the rookie scale. Whatever team gets him has less of a rookie scale. He is obviously extension eligible next season. And if you don't extend them during the offseason, you can't do so during the season. Rookie scale contracts just work that way. And just like if we don't extend Tyrese and up until I think is the beginning of the season, we can't extend them during the season. All of that does work both as a blessing and as a curse, because if he plays well, or if you're still optimistic about his upside, you could probably get him on a keeper extension. And then hopefully he breaks out during that extension and it will save you money. But still, you don't get much time to actually get to see him play before you have to make a decision on that. Only a year, obviously, until you have to make that decision. I do agree with the point about he was probably going to get traded to the Suns, but the Suns would rather have second round picks than they would Cam Whitmore. And I think let's say having Cam Whitmore makes it 2 second round picks instead of 5, right? I would not trade the 2 second-round picks the Rockets got for Cam Whitmore for the 5 the Rockets gave up. Because we gave up some really terrible second-round picks.
Right.
First of all, any second-round pick that's Houston's is probably going to be in the 50s because I would guess, I mean, knock on wood, obviously, but I would guess we are a top 10 team in the league throughout the next 7 years. Unless something tragic happens. That's probably the way it's going, right? Then we gave up a worst of a bunch of teams, so 2 of them contenders, if I'm not mistaken. We gave up pick 59, which is a glorified undrafted free agent. The only value it has, it's that the contract is cheaper because of the way the minimums work. But to me, I don't think it's really fair to make the comparison of, well, he was worth pick 20 and now he's worth less because of the rookie scale. I think that's a valid argument, but I think that gets countered value-wise by the fact that when Cam was drafted, a rookie guy coming into the league, you never know how it's going to go, right? Even if look at the Rockets, Kevin Smith Jr. was supposed to be this sharpshooter. He came in, and one of the most certain shooters. I mean, everybody was sure he was bona fide 38% at least from day one. Obviously, he wasn't. He's obviously building towards that. But this to say that until you actually play in the league, a lot of that value, obviously, before you make the pick, that's when the pick is at its peak value. And then it drops dramatically when you make the pick. And then it builds back up if the guy plays well in the league. And I think Cam has played well in the league. And I think he has shown an ability to make shots. Obviously, there's flaws in his game. There's flaws with his defensive intensity. There's flaws with him gambling on steals. There's flaws on him not being a good passer, which is a word everybody points to. But if you go look at his stats for a guy that played as little as he did, he was a productive player. And he is the type of guy that is primed, or let's talk in Rockets terms, that he is the type of guy that I would have loved the Rockets to trade for in the first year of the rebuild, where you have all the shots in the world, and this guy showed that he can make shots on high volume for his minutes. Let's see what he can actually do. And I do think that makes up for the loss in value of the 2 less years in the contract. Which leads me to my main point, which is I think the Rockets got 2 second-round picks, not really because, well, obviously it's a balance of, I think, those 2 factors that we mentioned, the 2 less years in the contract and the fact that he has shown some NBA productivity. I think those balance each other out, which means his value should be pick 20. Why did the Rockets not get pick 20? Well, there's a lot of things in the NBA that are not up to, well, that GMs can press the issue and take advantage of it, but are not really up to you, right? Cam was a good prospect, right? And is a good prospect. But if you could go back, it's hard to judge where they went wrong in his development, because the Rockets, when they drafted him, were moving in a different direction, right? Even Amen Thompson didn't get that many minutes year 1. And then in year 2, Amen fit the culture a lot better. He got those minutes, and there was never really a lot of space for Cam to play. And unless you're higher on Cam Whitmore than Jalen Green right now as a win-now prospect, it's hard to make the case for you as a 2C to play Cam more and Jalen less when Jalen is the better player right now, even though you might think that Cam has more upside maybe. That was never a logical decision to make early on. And so at that point, you find yourself in this situation. And then to kind of put a loop on the whole why Cam was not worth pick 20 at this moment, well, now you're kind of cornered into a situation where you didn't give him that much playing time in the first 2 years. Going into year 3, I think nobody argues that the KB trade was a great value deal for the Rockets. And so we would have made that deal again. And then after making that deal, I mean, even beforehand, but mainly afterward, let's say even if we don't make the KD trade and we sign someone with our MLE, the minutes crunch is even worse because Rockets traded Jalen Green and Dylan Brooks in a 2-for-1 deal, right? And if they hadn't, they would have still used their MLE, so it's essentially a 3-for-1 deal anyways. This to say that there was never a real path to minutes from Cam, unless he, like a man, was just a dog defensively, and Ime wanted to get him out there for that, and he was, more of a high field player than he actually is, and would have contributed to winning more right now. And so, sorry for the really convoluted way to get to this point, but let's bring it back. I argued that those 2 things, the 2 less years and his production at the NBA level, equal each other out. So his value is right now pick 20. When you take into consideration that, just like the KB trade, the Suns didn't get good value for KD because they were cornered into a position where they had no leverage, right? The Rockets with Cam Whitmore were also cornered into a position where they didn't really have much leverage. It's like, well, this guy's clearly not going to play. He's clearly disgruntled. The Rockets clearly don't want to have a guy that's souring the locker room. It's easy to say, oh, just sit on the bench, but then you got to actually look the guy in the eye every day and tell him that he can play. And, the Rockets don't want that to be one of the reasons that something potentially goes wrong in the season where they're trying to win. And they don't want a sour relationship with a player and an agent. We've shown over time how important that is. So the Rockets are in a position where they're not going to get, 4 cents on the dollar or 4 quarters on the dollar for Cam. They're going to get less because they're in a position where, to quote someone who I've never thought I would quote, the Rockets don't hold the cards. So I'm sorry. And so at this point, you're gonna get less value than what he's worth in my mind. But that's just logical because, well, you don't have to move him, but you do well to move him. You're not gonna be able to play him, so his value is not gonna go up anymore unless there's an injury or probably a few injuries. And so you got, probably like 80% of what Cam's worth. You got 2 second-round picks. You could probably trade them for pick 31 this draft if you had them at the time.
Just like Suns did for pick 31.
Just like the Suns did. And, well, let's say you dropped 11 spots in value. Well, that's the situation you find yourself in when you draft a lot of guys and you can't play them all. And now I'm not going to say it's a good thing, but it's a sign that things went right. Because if the Rockets were still in a position where they could play 8 guys, 7 guys, a really large young core, that means that they probably aren't that good yet. And if you take Cam and you go to other contenders and you see where would Cam play, well, Cam wouldn't play in OKC. Cam would probably play in Denver, but Denver is so far along where their stars are already extended that he wouldn't play there back when some of them were on their rookie deals. And so Cam wouldn't play in most of these contenders. And so you were just stuck in a position where, from a value standpoint, you took what you could get, which I think was, 3 quarters on the dollar. But you just weren't in a position to be able to demand for more because you weren't in a position where you were okay waiting it out further. Because going into year 3, if you can play Cam, he's not going to gain more value. And you have a ticking time bomb both in the locker room because he's not going to be happy, and in his contract situation because, well, if it's bad selling him with 2 years left on his deal, it's even worse selling him with 1, especially if you didn't have the playing time to make him more of a well-perceived prospect, I guess. So all of this really long diatribe, I'm sorry for going on for so long. I do think it made sense, but I wasn't quite concise enough. This to say that it's a fine deal. Doesn't feel good. I'll tell you, it doesn't feel good. I'm high on Cam, but that's the price of jumping from, that's part of the price of jumping from a team that was the worst in the league for 3 seasons into a team that's now probably, according to the odds, top 3 in chances to actually win the championship. And then I'll kind of close the loop by saying, I do think that Cam Whitmore is going to have an incredible season in Washington, and I do think Cam Whitmore has the potential to be a really good player. But at the very least, I'm fairly certain he'll have a volume, a season scoring on good volume, on good efficiency. And I do think that there will be points in this season where the Rockets are on a 2 or 3 game losing streak, and Cam Whitmore has a 30-point game, and everybody was saying, "Oh, we could have used that guy," and obviously that's flawed. But I do think that that's going to happen. But the Rockets, regarding Cam, were just in a lose-lose situation, and so I think they made the most out of the position that they were in, that they put themselves in, right? But not really at their own fault, because I think all the decisions that led to this point were logical, or defensible at least. So I don't think this is some major blunder. I just think it's not the best, but it's not. It doesn't put any sort of stain on what has been an incredible offseason by Rafael and the front office.
Right. It's fine. That's the best way I would characterize it. And to your point on his floor being higher after 2 years, because you're right. Sometimes skills, for whatever reason, don't translate, even if they're supposed to be close to a lock. And so, yeah, there's a little more value now in knowing that at least some of Cam's skills have translated. The all-out bust scenario is not there. He's at least going to be viable in some configurations. What I meant in terms of the risk profile is what is the upside? What are the scenarios where he really hits at a high-end level? I don't think that the odds of that are any higher than they were 2 years ago. Now, I don't think they're necessarily any lower as well, but they're also not higher. And with first-round picks, teams tend to think more in terms of upside. And if the upside is the same, then that's why I think the contract being a little bit shorter will decrease his value. Not a lot, just a little bit. Your point is valid about, the floor scenarios being mitigated simply based on having 2 years of data. Well, something of 2 years of data, because obviously he wasn't in the rotation last year. But this is getting in the weeds. Bottom line, the deal is fine. It doesn't feel great because, yeah, he could turn out to be a very good player, but the Rockets just didn't have the runway that they thought they would. And I think that's the bottom line on this is, the one argument you could make is that, well, if you didn't have the opportunity to develop him, why did you make this pick in 2023? Because undoubtedly, it's been reported that other teams were trying to move up for Cam when he slid in the draft. The Rockets easily could have traded that pick for a future first rounder in 24, 25, or further out. The bottom line, I don't think anyone in the Rockets front office thought in June of 2023 that they'd be anywhere near as good as they actually are by June 2025. I think this caught them by surprise. I think if you had told them that year two of Ime Udoka, they'd be 52-30, number 2 in the West, they'd have looked at you like you were crazy. And that's if they got all 3 of their free agency targets the next week with Fred VanVleet, Brook Lopez, and Dillon Brooks. They only ended up getting 2 of the 3. So I think this escalated so quickly that the Rockets just didn't have the developmental runway that they expected. A lot of the social media reaction has been built around this idea that while Cam didn't get the opportunities that Jalen and Jabari and other prospects in recent years did to play through their struggles. No, he didn't, because the situation changed. He wasn't drafted during the Silas years, the all-out rebuilding. He came into a situation when it was already on the upswing, and it turned out that it was the ascent much more rapid than anyone, including the Rockets themselves, anticipated. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. He could absolutely be a good player, but I just think it was very hard to project in 2023. Had the Rockets known this, that it would escalate as quickly as it did, my guess is they would have traded that pick knowing that it would be difficult to give him the minutes that he needed to develop. They just did not know that then. Hindsight is 2020. So, from an asset standpoint, that should close the loop. It's pretty understandable. In terms of the basketball, I think a lot of this is making a mountain out of a molehill. This offseason has been so good, as you mentioned, Paolo, that it feels like we've almost got to nitpick something just to not be positive all the time. The reality, this pales in comparison to the guys they brought in, and most notably a perennial all-star in Kevin Durant. Think of it this way. If Cam Whitmore was actually in the KD trade instead of those 5 second-round picks, if Phoenix had opted for that path, nobody would have batted an eye. We would have said, it's KD, nobody cares. It's because the deal came separately that there's all this second guessing and this Monday morning quarterbacking. If Cam was in the KD trade and the Suns had that option, they just went a different direction, we wouldn't have thought anything of it. We'd say, well, it's tough, but that's what you got to do to bring in Kevin Durant. So I would start the basketball analysis there by saying he basically was part of the KD trade. And even if technically he wasn't, I think it's pretty clear now that bringing in KD meant that the Rockets were making a shift to winning now. And that's why as soon as Fred VanVleet restructured his contract, I think that was 3 days after the KD trade agreement, I said on this very podcast, you can listen to our Loggerline archives, that I thought Cam Whitmore's days were numbered, because if they were going to make a non-taxpayer MLE signing, and they did with Dorian Finney-Smith, to bring in someone that's more capable of being a winning player now, backfilling that Dillon Brooks role with 3 and D, it was just going to be hard to get Cam the minutes that he needed in year 3. And year 3 is a point where, for business reasons, for basketball reasons, he needs to play, he wants to play, and it just didn't make sense, especially once Fred restructured his deal to where the Rockets would have a lot of financial wiggle room. So the bottom line for me, the Rockets had a superior path. They went down that path, and it's a bummer to lose Cam because he does still have talent, but I don't have any regrets. I think, some people raise the question of, should they have given him developmental runway the last 2 years in place of Jalen Green? I personally find that to be ridiculous. I think Jalen's playoffs were underwhelming, but this is the guy the last 60 games who put up nearly 23 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists per game on above 56% true shooting. The idea that Cam Whitmore at 19, 20 years old is going to be better than Jalen Green is just silly, especially because, as you pointed out during the year, Paolo, Cam is a play finisher at this stage of his career. He's not a creator, which Jalen, for all of his flaws, can do. So it's not an apples to apples comparison to begin with, even if you want to consider them both shooting guards. But aside from that, the idea that Ime Udoka and Rafael Stone are as brilliant as people around the NBA think, and they have sky-high approval ratings right now, but yet somehow they had this huge blind spot to where even watching Cam Whitmore every day in practices, in the off seasons, in G League stints, I think a lot of fans, it feels like they're not learning about Cam because they're not seeing him on the court. That's not the case when we're talking about the Rockets. They are learning. They have data points that we don't. So this idea that Ime Udoka and Rafael Stone are great at their jobs and getting all this praise as Coach of the Year, Executive of the Year candidates, I think both were top 5 last season, and yet they had this enormous blind spot and couldn't see what was right in front of them. I find that very unlikely. I've seen in Ime's case, a few people have pointed out Peyton Pritchard in Boston as an example that, well, maybe he trusts his veterans a little too much. And it's not like Jalen Green's a veteran, but he's a couple of years more advanced than Cam in terms of his NBA years. The thing about Peyton Pritchard, he actually played fewer minutes and fewer games the following season under Joe Mazzulla than he did under Ime Udoka. So this idea that Ime Udoka was holding back and he couldn't see what was right underneath his face at practice, that doesn't really hold up. Peyton Pritchard is a 6-man of the year type guy now after he gradually developed over a course of 2-3 years. But no, I do not think that in 21, 22, when Ime Udoka was taking that team to the NBA Finals, that he had this brilliant 6-man type right on his bench and he just didn't give him an opportunity. No, he wasn't the same guy then. And I think that's a pretty good analogy for the Cam Whitmore situation the last couple of years. The potential is there 2-3 years down the line for Cam to be someone who the Rockets could really use, but he's not that guy now. I don't think he's that close. I think he would put up numbers this year in Washington. He probably will. To your point, Paolo, he's probably going to put up, if he gets a real opportunity, it wouldn't shock me, 18 points a game, something like that, and do so on reasonable efficiency. But I don't think he's going to be a winning player. I don't think he's all that close to it, and that's not a shot at Cam. It takes time. The Rockets just did not have the luxury of that time. And maybe it'd be different if he got a start earlier in his career, the way Jalen and Jabari did, but that's just timing. I mean, Jalen and Jabari got drafted during the rebuild. Cam got drafted. We didn't know the rebuild was as shut as it was, but when the switch had flipped under Ime Udoka, and so he didn't get the runway. Sometimes that happens. So if you trust Ime Udoka and you trust Rafael Stone, I don't get this notion that they have this huge blind spot, and after watching this guy for years, couldn't see what was right in front of them, and all of a sudden he's going to get this opportunity in Washington and be a standout player. No, I think it's just he might be ready, but the Rockets just simply don't have the time, especially because they are also trying to develop Reed Sheppard. That's the other part of this that I want to underscore. If Cam Whitmore was the only young player that you were trying to develop, then I think they might have been more patient. They might have given him a smaller role, played this out longer, at least into year 4, the final year of his rookie scale contract, just to see what happens. And maybe he breaks out. But it's very difficult on a team that's this good to play 2 completely unproven young guys. Look at the Warriors with the 2 timelines approach that largely failed when they brought in, 3 lottery picks, Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, James Wiseman. It's tough to develop that many young and unproven guys at once if they all need minutes. Now, if a guy is actually good day one, the way, say, Amen Thompson was, that's different. But if the young guys are all developing and you are trying to compete at the highest level, it's tough to play 2, 3 of those guys at once. And I think that's the situation the Rockets found themselves in, where, after the KD trade, you could have given opportunities to both Reed and Cam and gone with them as your 8th and 9th men. But that's a lot of youth for a team that's trying to win a championship. I think they had to choose, and I think they just believe in Reed a little bit more, and they have more invested in him. There's a reason why they drafted him at number 3 and Cam at number 20, so it shouldn't surprise you. It doesn't mean I've seen some of the reaction on social media to Rafael's quote about not being a developmental team anymore. And there's this pushback of, oh, what about Reed? What does this mean for the future? Are we going to be like the late 2010s where your top summer league prospect is Chris Clemens and you routinely trade your draft picks every single year? No, it doesn't mean that. You can still have a blend between a contending roster and a developmental pipeline. I mean, some of your young guys, as mentioned, like Hamen, may be ready day one. And then it doesn't even matter that they're young. They pretty much don't count as young because they're already contributing to winning. And then guys in their first year, maybe their first 2 years, there's usually not an expectation to play them major minutes. They're okay with the G League. If they're drafted late in the first round and the second, those guys, because the expectations are lower, they might be okay stretching it into year 3, year 4. Some guys need development, so their expectations in their initial NBA years for playing time are lower. So this is not saying that you can't have prospects moving forward. You can. The reason this situation was delicate, it is very difficult to have two young guys who are both lottery level talent, who both desperately need and want to play, and yet neither of them to this point has shown you that they're a winning player. This is a unique situation, and that's why I think the Rockets weren't willing to continue playing this out with Cam Whitmore. It's because you also needed to develop Reed Sheppard, and having two of those guys in basically the same spot of their careers, getting the same runway, that's asking a lot on a team that's this good. So moving forward, no, it does not mean that they're not going to develop prospects, because some guys have lower expectations. There's some that may be comfortable being stashed overseas or in the G League. There's some because they're year 1, year 2 that may be content not playing. Cam going into year 3, and the Rockets having another guy in Reed Sheppard who was similarly young and unproven, yet clearly needing playing time as well if he's going to develop. All of this squeezed Cam out. It's unfortunate. It would not surprise me if Cam ends up having a strong year in Washington. But I understand why the Rockets came to the conclusion that they did. That's the bottom line for me. Reed Sheppard is someone they believe in, and if you're going to give Reed runway, it's tough on a team that's this good to give Cam Whitmore anywhere close to that level of runway. And if you aren't, it just makes sense to move on. And no, you shouldn't then assume that, well, development doesn't matter, that they're going to throw away all these draft picks in future years and make reckless trades. No, I think you can have a blend between contending and still having some young guys in the pipeline as well. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not black or white. There are some shades of gray here. There is some nuance. It's just in this particular case, Reed and Cam both was a difficult mix. They chose Reed. He's going to be the developmental priority this year among guys getting minutes. And moving forward, there are some limitations. It's not going to be all out development like the rebuilding years, but it's also not going to be like the late 2010s where Chris Clemens is your young player headliner when you go to Las Vegas for Summer League. You can do both. It was just difficult on this particular team to do Reed and Cam both. And for a multitude of reasons, I think the Rockets viewed Reed as having a little bit more upside. That's sort of how I rationalize it. Paolo, is there anything else you wanted to add on the Cam front before we turn our attention to Reed and the guys who actually are going to be here?
I'd just like to add that you can't want both things. Ime Udoka is obviously a coach that picked up this team as the worst team in the league and turned it into the 2 seed in 2 seasons. He turned this team from a laughing stock in the league to a team where Kevin Durant, one of the league's best players, wanted to come to, and when specifically made it a point to make it so the Rockets had to pay very little price to get him here. You can't want to be one of the best defensive teams in the league, have one of the best cultures, and then have your coach have his hands tied when it comes to the rotation. Playing Cam Whitmore for development over the past 2 years, more than he has played or had played, would have been not holding the same standard to everybody. Because Cam did not play with the same defensive intensity for most of the games as the other guys that played over him did. And none of the other guys ever made a fuss about not playing, much less so a public fuss like Cam did in that infamous interview that he had during this season. Right? If you want to build a culture and you want to have one of these coaches that are synonymous with the franchise, synonymous with the culture, you can't at the same time not let them make good decisions. And we complained that Rafael Stone had too much of a hand in the rotation, or I didn't complain, but other people did, during the Silas years. You want a coach with a strong mind. You want a coach that is going to impose a culture that's going to set the standard. You can't at the same time want him to play a guy just because he's talented and not because he's, giving you what you need to succeed and playing winning basketball, which I don't think you can argue Cam was. And so there's really not much more to say about it. It's just, I don't think anybody will argue that that Ime Udoka hiring was a home run in basically every sense. That comes at a price, right? You can't get just the good things from every type of coaching philosophy out there, right? You can't get a team that's trying to win to at the same time hamstring itself by playing someone who is not better than the guys that are playing in front of him, because it's not really about was Jalen Green also not a winning player. Well, Jalen probably wasn't a winning player when you look at all the stats. At the same time, Cam Whitmore wasn't better. I'm sorry. On a small sample size, he did shoot 36% from three. At the same time, he just didn't play the basketball that was conducive to winning. And obviously, you can make the argument that at certain points in the season and that at certain points in the playoffs, he should have been given a chance. But if you don't play a guy consistently throughout the entire season, it's hard to trust him when the playoffs come around. It's probably, in the mind of a coach, it's probably a lot easier to believe that a guy like Jalen might have an outburst, might snap out of it because he's done it before. It's at least debatable what you should do. But at the same time, you can't want everything. You can't want to have one of the most drastic upturns that a team has ever had across 2 years while playing most of your young guys, and at the same time want to prioritize playing guys that are not conducive to winning at this point. And then that, from the basketball perspective, and anybody that picks up a drawing board or a piece of paper and tries to map out a rotation knows it would have taken 3 or 4 injuries before Cam Whitmore would be able to play more. Well, it will take probably 3 injuries before he's able to play 10 to 15 minutes. It would have taken probably 4 injuries, maybe more, for him to play 20 consistent minutes a night, which is probably what he wants at this point. So he doesn't want to be a spot minutes guy. Right now, he's not even he would not have been even a spot minutes guy on this team. He would have been a no minutes guy on this team. So yeah, it's just tough reality. I do think Cam Whitmore is talented, and I do think that he's going to maybe be a star in this league. But at the very least, be a productive scorer, whether that translates to winning or not. But it just wasn't meant to be here, and we just didn't have the pathway for him to achieve that.
Right. And this past year's team especially, which was a classic, the sum is greater than the individual parts. The sometimes you, sometimes me, always us, the tunnel vision, the lack of defensive awareness, those would have been real issues for this particular team.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing that I forgot, which is there's another thing from a culture standpoint. It's not just about what you did on the court. That entire interview and that entire being pouty and then having like your face show like all of that negative emotion. Look across this team. Amanda Thompson was a starter or was a bench player, became a starter, and then went off the bench again and then became a starter full time.
Jabari acted his bench role.
Yep, that was going to be my closing one, but even more so, just a more similar situation. Reed Sheppard didn't play for a long time, although he's obviously a year younger, but he didn't, and he probably fit a need more than what Cam did. Obviously, you talked about Jabari Smith Jr. was a bona fide starter and then went off the bench, and in the playoffs played less minutes than what a lot of people believed he should have played. Even Tari Eason was once upon a time on this team a considered better than Jabari, and Jabari started over him for a really long time, and he never saw anybody complain. And if you're gonna hold that standard for everybody else, Cam can't be doing stuff like that, and neither can any guy that they bring in. And I guarantee you, even if it's a vet, let's say Dorian Finney-Smith is not getting the minutes that he probably deserves. If he throws a fuss, I don't think that he'll be one for this team. Obviously, have no reason to believe he would. Just throwing out an example, but that one night where Cam came out with all that stuff, I think was pretty damning. And from that point on, it's hard to even make the argument.
Yeah. And saying all that, I do still think he can be a very good player in this league. The athleticism, the power, the scoring potential. He's got a unique package, and he has the potential to put it all together. But I don't think it's going to happen by this fall. If somehow it does, then yeah, it's fair to second guess. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think even if he puts up numbers in terms of it contributing to winning and being an all-around player, that's going to take 2 to 3 years. And the Rockets simply did not have that type of time, especially if you were also prioritizing Reed Sheppard in that same window. Now, if Reed turns out to be a bust and doesn't play well, then maybe years down the line, we can second guess this. But for right now, I think it's completely understandable, and I'm ready to turn the page and look at Reed in Summer League and the rest of the offseason. Now, our listeners might ask, why did you just spend 30 plus minutes talking about Cam Whitmore, a guy who's no longer on the roster? And I think one reason we did, besides trying to explain the thought process, there's honestly not a lot to talk about when it comes to the rest of the offseason. And Rafael said it himself at the press conference. There were a number of good quotes, but this is the one that stood out to me because it makes sense and I think it's honest. When asked about the potential for further moves, I like our team as is. We're hard capped at the first apron and we have no space left. So I think it's very likely we'll enter the season looking very similar to the way we look now. It's pretty hard not to. Then in a follow-up interview the next day with Matt Thomas on Sports Talk 790, he mentioned having the potential to maybe tweak the 14th and 15th spots on the roster. Nate Williams is on a minimum deal that isn't guaranteed until October, but the overarching sentiment is the same. Moves of significance are probably done. And I think he's being honest in that, and you should be okay with it. This is not like the press conference after the Warriors series ended where he said, I would bet on continuity. And obviously it's not continuity. Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, Jock Landale going out, and Kevin Durant, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Clint Capella going in. That's what you say, especially right after a season ends, because you have no idea what the market is going to hold weeks, months down the line. And the last thing you want to do, especially if you have a team that's good already, it's not like the Rockets were desperate. They were young and coming off the 52-30 season, number 2 in the West. The last thing we do is make the public standard, well, we've got to upgrade. And then if somehow the right deal doesn't materialize, then it's really awkward when you report back to training camp for the fall because the team and the players feel like that the GM doesn't believe in them. No, they're going to say that they're okay staying the course right up until the moment that they don't. That's just how it works. In this case, I think, well, for starters, it makes more sense to stay the course because KD, Dorian, and Capella relative to Jalen, Dylan, and Jock Landale, those are clear upgrades in my opinion. And also Steven Adams, your backup center, should be better next year than he was this past year, now being 2 years removed from his knee surgery. And your young guys, especially your influential ones, Alperen Sengun, Amen Thompson, Jabari, all getting better as their careers progress. There's reasons when you look at the 52-30 baseline, and then you look at the upgrades they made this offseason and the young players they kept that are at a point in their careers where they should still be getting better. Yeah, there's ample reasons to think they're good enough as is. There's a reason why they're, as you pointed out, Paolo, they're second or third in the odds rankings to win the title next year. This is a really good team as is. So it makes sense for them to stay the course. But I also think just financially, when you look at the options or lack thereof, he mentioned that they're right up against the first apron, which is true. They spent their non-taxpayer mid-level exception. They're above the salary cap. They don't have many tools. And then as far as the trade market, I mean, they're pretty boxed in. When you look at what they could conceivably do, I get the curiosity that comes from whenever you bring a star in like Kevin Durant, there's always this natural wondering, especially in the post, LeBron and the Heat, KD and the Warriors, this post super team era of, does this mean other stars are going to want to team up? I think largely that era is on its way out because of the new collective bargaining agreement, but we're so close in time to the super team era that it's natural to wonder that. But I don't think that that really makes sense financially here, because if you were to hypothetically try to bring in Giannis, and at this point, there's no indication that he's imminently going to ask for a trade. In fact, the Bucks waiving Damian Lillard and doing what they did to bring in Miles Turner would suggest that they have some indication that he's at least willing to give it more time. Otherwise, I don't think they make moves nearly that drastic and handicap themselves financially even more. if you were to make the type of move that people speculated about after the Clint Capella signing of Şengün plus Tari plus whatever filler to bring in Giannis, it doesn't work with the first apron in most of these scenarios because you can't have a 10 or 11 man roster. You have to fill out the roster to get back up to the minimum threshold. And even if you stick to minimum guys, well, you add those on to the bigger salary of a guy like Giannis that's in the 50s. Same could theoretically apply if LeBron asks out of LA, which some people think that he's quietly trying to do. You wouldn't be able to stay under the first apron because by the time you backfill those roster spots, even at the minimum, and you add that on to a salary of someone like Giannis or LeBron that's in the 50s, you're going to be above that first apron relative to what you send out because the Rockets just don't have enough tradable salary. And, it's important to remember all the guys they signed this offseason, not just the newcomers that they traded for or signed, but also the extensions, guys like Fred VanVleet and even the veteran guys, Jae'Sean Tate, Aaron Holiday that signed for the minimum. I think Jabari Smith as an extension guy. Basically, everyone who signed new contracts, with the one exception being Steven Adams, is untradeable for a period of several months. 6 months, December 15th. It varies some based on the circumstance. But the bottom line is, like, half your roster is untradeable now, even if you wanted to trade them. So you don't have any options. You can't make the math work being that close to the first apron, at least during the offseason. Now, maybe it changes during the season when salaries, are prorated because you've already paid some of the payments for this coming year's contracts. And also, 10-day contracts come into play and more guys become trade eligible. The guys who signed during the offseason or you traded for. So, yeah, it's possible like during the season, December, January, February, the Rockets could look around, and if someone like Giannis wants out, there might be a conversation to be had at that time. But for now, over half your roster is untradeable. You're right up against the apron. I don't see how a consolidation trade would work, even if there was a star that was going to ask out, and I don't see who that would be. And then if you go to the other end of the spectrum and you look at depth trades, I don't see why the Rockets with a 9-man rotation as is, and with quality bets all the way down to 10, 11, 12 spots on your bench, guys like Aaron Holiday, Jae'Sean Tate, Jeff Green. I don't see the Rockets doing a trade where they send out $1 for 4 quarters. I don't see that making sense. And most of your team is untradeable anyway. So I don't see a trade, even if the Rockets theoretically could make a deal. I don't see one that's feasible over the next few weeks. So because of that, I don't think this is Rafael just blowing smoke and saying, well, yeah, we're comfortable with this right up until the moment that he isn't. No, when you look at how they put this roster together, I just don't think it makes sense to do anything over the remainder of this offseason. For starters, because you should like the team as is. There's a reason why people around the league are raving about what the Rockets did. But I just don't see, does it make sense to do a consolidation trade? And financially, it probably won't work. I also don't know who the star would be. And it certainly doesn't make sense to go the other direction and trade for depth when you already have so much. No, I think they're comfortable where they're at, and this is largely going to be what they take to training camp. Maybe there's a move around the margins. If you think there's a guard you like a little bit more than Nate Williams, maybe you can do something tiny like that at the very end of your bench. I think they're pretty set, and I don't think this is them blowing smoke, and I think it's probably the smart play. Like, I've seen some talk that, well, should they have hard capped themselves at the first apron if it prohibits flexibility to this extent? Again, I don't think a superstar was going to come available anyway. I think the Miles Turner signing and the Damian Lillard wave and stretch signaled that Giannis, at least for the time being, isn't going to be on the market. And I'm sure the Rockets had some back channel communications that, led to them coming to the same conclusion. But I also think you have to look at everything as pieces to a puzzle. And you can't assume that everything else that happened this offseason stays the same if you take out one particular signing. Like, let's say they don't sign Dorian Finney-Smith. And so if they don't spend the non-taxpayer MLE, they're not hard capped at the apron. And maybe they give that role to Cam Whitmore, or maybe they sign someone at the taxpayer MLE level, or maybe, I don't know, maybe instead of expanding the Durant trade to include Capella, maybe they keep Landale and they expand the Durant trade to bring in like a 3-and-D guy that's making, $7 million, whatever room they had financially to expand the KD trade. Even if you did something like that, then I don't think the rest of your offseason goes the same way, because these moves are all interconnected. Bringing in Kevin Durant and the need to have access to that non-taxpayer mid-level exception, that's why Fred VanVleet took such a large pay cut. Jabari probably took the deal he did in part because the Rockets needed to know what they'd have him on the books for during the Kevin Durant talks. We talked about that in the last pod. Even your minimum guys like Jay Shaw and Aaron, I think they could have gotten more than the minimum on the open market, but they took minimums because it's the best Houston had. If Houston suddenly had more than the minimum because they weren't up against that apron, I think they're asking for more money. They probably get more money, especially Fred. I think he gets more money than 25. So I don't think you can look at any of these variables in isolation. They're all interconnected. They're pieces to a puzzle. And one thing I think the Rockets have done very well, they've leveraged these other deals, the arrival of Kevin Durant, and certainly, bringing in someone like KD, players want to be on a contender, but also just the financial math. So many deals around the NBA break down over respect or a perceived lack thereof from players and especially from agents. And so if the Rockets weren't right up against the first apron, if they didn't have the concerns that they now have 2 years from now in terms of Amin being on the first year of his max deal at the same time that KD is on year 2 of his inevitable extension, that consideration is probably why you got the 2 non-guaranteed years on the Dorian Finney-Smith contract for year 3 and year 4, because he sees the team around them. He wants to be in Houston. And so it's the best way, the only way really, that it can work financially. With Fred, he took the deal he took, and perhaps Steven Adams as well earlier in the month, because that's the most he could get while the Rockets had access to the non-taxpayer and could stay underneath the first apron. So all this talk about, well, could you have had more flexibility if you change just one signing? Like if you don't sign Dorian Finney-Smith and you go a little bit lower in that 3 and D bracket, or you just keep Cam Whitmore, which I think is a popular take for some. I don't think it's as simple as looking at that in isolation, because then the entire chain breaks down. You got so many good deals in large part because of the restriction, because the Rockets can say, no, we're not disrespecting you. This is literally all we have. This is the only way that it can make it work. I've seen so many deals over my years covering the NBA break down because, and it's not so much that players are greedy. We see that like on Astros Twitter all the time. People turning into the players. Why do they need this many million? No, it's not about that. It's about respect. It's about feeling valued by their team, what percentile they're in amongst their peers. That stuff matters. And so if you're asking them to make a sacrifice, they need something tangible for it to be worthwhile. They need to see Kevin Durant. They need to see who you're bringing in with that non-taxpayer mid-level exception. The idea that these guys are going to take the same discounts because, theoretically, we might have the flexibility to pursue Giannis weeks down the line, that's not going to fly, especially because I think people around the league know that Giannis, if he does get traded at some point in the next calendar year, it's probably going to be during the season at this point, based on everything that we're seeing from Milwaukee. And by that point, a lot more of the league is going to be available anyway, because guys that sign this offseason are going to be trade eligible for the most part by December 15th. Right now, like 40% of the league is untradeable because they just signed new contracts or got traded. So now is not the time. And with that in mind, the flexibility that you lost by not being able to do anything the rest of this offseason, it really isn't that much, because I don't think there's that many moves to be had anyway. I think the team is good enough. I think the options are minimal as it is. And so I think the Rockets and Rafael Stone are genuinely content with where they are. I don't think it's lip service. I think they'll always explore the market and see if any upgrades are out there. But I think their view is, we want to start this season as we are. We like our team. And if it doesn't go well, then by December 15th and leading into the early February trade deadline, yeah, maybe there's a different conversation to be had. But for now, I think they're genuine. This is what they're going to be by and large when training camp opens in late September, early October. I think they're happy with it, and I think they should be happy with it.
There's just not basically any way in which they can make another move until obviously Clint Capella, Steven Adams, and Dorian Finney-Smith become tradable, and Fred VanVleet becomes tradable. You have $25 million you can trade in Fred. You have $13 million you can trade in Adams, and $13 million you can trade in Dorian Finney-Smith, and $7 million you can trade in Clint Capella. Besides that, what you have KD, who you're not going to trade. You have Şengün, who you're not going to trade. You have Reed Sheppard, who you're not going to trade. You have Tarizan, who you're not going to trade. So nothing's going to happen until December 15th when these players become tradable again. And even then, I'm not sure something will happen then, because I think they are legitimately pretty happy with what they have. They've made major improvements on many categories, and it just makes sense to get a big sample on what you have right now before you commit more assets to make another move. And then beyond that, I want to take a point on what you said about the extensions or in the free agent contracts. I also think that having a team as successful or as appealing as we currently have for a guy like Tarizan, for example, I think there's a factor of, okay, I kind of want to get my contract extension now, not just because of the security and the money, but also because of the security that it makes sure that I will be here at least for another year, because it's not prohibitive. I think guys can get traded with that extension signed, but poison pill, it's really hard to do. And it's like, I think that is something that weighs on Tari's decision to extend versus not to extend, which is, listen, if I extend, I'm probably here on a contender. They value me because we know the Rockets value Tari probably even over Jabari, although the extension probably won't reflect that. I'm valued here. They stuck with me through my really bad leg injury. Tari Eason is the typical player that wants to be on a good team. And so I think that factors in as well. And yeah, I think as far as that entire conversation over not using the MLE so you're not hard capped so you can make a move like a trade free honest right now, first of all, it's very unlikely. That's really like that happens at this point. But even more than that, listen, you can slip on a banana peel and be hard capped in the NBA right now. If you do anything that increases your payroll, a trade in which you take $1 more than you send out, you spend $1 over the taxpayer MLE, which is about 5 or 6 million, I believe, you're hard capped at the first April. It's and basically anything you do, you use a traded player exception that's not from this year, you're hard capped. Like basically almost anything hard caps you at the first apron. Interesting point on the first apron working as a negotiating tool for the teams, because I never really thought about that. It does make sense that it's a lot different to approach a negotiation, like you said. Just repeating what you said at this point, it makes a lot of sense when approaching a negotiation to say, hey, we're gonna bring in Dorian Finney-Smith, and for example, for Clint Capella, for example, we're gonna bring in Dorian Finney-Smith who needs to fill out these roster spots. We got KD. You might want, I don't know, taxpayer MLE type money or a room MLE type money. It's all we can give you is the money we have right now. And if you want to come, you can come. Like it simplifies negotiations a lot. And it never strikes the opposition as penny pinching, and it never strikes the opposition as negotiation tactics, because it's literally what you can offer.
Yep. And along the same lines, the Capella signing, which is basically a starting salary around $7 million or a little bit above it, or a little bit below it, excuse me. There was no negotiating there because that was exactly how much financial wiggle room they had with expanding the KD trade. So the same concept applies there. In all of these, it's here's what we have. It's the maximum we can offer to make it work on our books. Do you want to be here? And in most cases, especially when you have Kevin Durant, you have a legitimate contender. Players want to be here. We talked about that in recent pods. This is a tier 1 destination now. So if players want to be here, the only way these negotiations are not going to end favorably is if the sides are so far apart financially, which I don't think is the case. I don't think any of these contracts is just, unacceptable for the player. They're friendly for the team, but they're not like insane. And if it's close, then the only other way the deal wouldn't get to the finish line is if disrespect enters the equation. And if you are doing all you reasonably can within understandable parameters, then I think the players are going to feel, and I think they have felt respected this offseason. That goes back to, one of the founding principles of the Rafael Stone administration, this idea that, relationships matter, building them with players, with agents. And this is just another element of that. This is the same underlying principle. And these guys feel respected. And even if the deal, and in most cases, the deals are favorable to the team, if the player and their agent feel respected, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what's happened this offseason. And anyone wanting to revisit one deal out of isolation shouldn't view it as, well, you could theoretically have changed this, but then everything else is the same. And then look what else we could have done. No, everything is interconnected. They're pieces to a puzzle. I think the Rockets methodically planned this out, led by Rafael Stone, Eli White, Patrick Fertitta in that front office. And this is the end result. And I don't think you should have any regrets. This is a really good team. And yeah, I think everybody should be content going into the season as is. Maybe it doesn't turn out as well as we think or we hope. And if that's the case, then they'll have optionality December 15th leading up to the trade deadline. But for now, yeah, I think they're content with where they are, and we don't have too much to talk about moving forward in terms of roster construction, because I think where they are today is where they're going to be by the time training camp rolls around in late September, early October. All right, last segment I want to get to before we close out the pod, and we'll be quick on this because I know we're over an hour in already. Summer League starts tonight. It's not a roster with many names that you will know. By far, the most notable one is Reed Sheppard, who will start at point guard. I don't know if he's going to play all 5 games. I think the more likely scenario is that he plays 2 or 3 like Cam Whitmore did when he was in his second year last year before shutting it down. You have a couple of two-ways. Kevon Harris, a wing player they recently signed, previously played with the Magic, capable defender. Vali Dante, big man out of Oregon, who they had in the two-way last year. They did have Moses Brown on their roster, which is interesting because conceivably between Brown and Dante, you could play double big. And so for Reed, give him some exposure playing with a double big lineup, because obviously he did not have much of that as a rookie. And we do know moving forward, based on certainly the presence of Şengün and Adams, but also adding Capella, Rafael Stone confirmed at his press conference, they do want to explore double big more next season. So perhaps you see that. Beyond that, you have Cameron Matthews, the defensive forward type from Mississippi State. You have Jermaine Samuels Jr., who's been a quality player on the Summer League team the last few years. Nate Williams, who, as I mentioned, his minimum spot could perhaps be at risk if the Rockets wanted to do something along the margins. So it could incentivize him to have a strong Summer League. But by and large, it's not a sexy roster. Reed's the only guy of note that I would expect to play, barring extreme injuries, rotation minutes for the Rockets next season. In terms of what to watch for, I'm not going to focus too much on the shooting or the defense. The shooting, because look, that's foundational. If the shooting doesn't hit at a high level for Reed, it's not going to work out. Like, that's got to be there. And also, we saw signs from February onward last year. Reed shot over 40% from 3-point range. So I think the shooting is going to be fine. And Summer League's a tough gauge of that anyway, because when you're by far the best player on the team, or at least the one that commands the most respect, who knows how many open looks he's going to get. So I'm not going to look too much. And there's the small sample component as well of, do the shots go in or do they not? And defensively, he's got the quick hands, and he said this week, Reed, that he's gotten stronger, but Summer League and the NBA are different animals in that regard. Like last year in Summer League, when Reed was all Summer League first team, he had a ton of quick hands type plays where he would get in the passing lanes, he would rip guys on their way up, and it was different in real NBA games. The level of competition, the level of experience, it's just apples to oranges. We know Reed is a high IQ player, so I expect him to have a few defensive highlights, but as for whether it's going to translate in the fall, even if he looks really good defensively in Summer League, I'm not sure that I'm going to take that much out of it. The area I'm focused on the most, and I think the Rockets are as well, is on Reed developing as a point guard. That's what Garrett Jackson, the Summer League head coach, normally an assistant to Ime during the regular season, said he wanted to see from Reed, talking about the drive and kick elements of his game, the pull-ups, the floaters. What can he do to generate offense for his teammates? What can he do when defenders close out on the three-point line? Because he is viewed on the scouting report as being an elite shooter. Got off to a slow start, but again, February onward, above 40% from 3. That's where I think you can see some things, even in a Summer League environment, because some of it just comes down to fluidity. That drive and kick game, do you have the awareness to see guys out of the corner of your eye? Do you have the fluidity to get to the pull-up, the floater, whatever the situation calls for? That Chris Paul ability to, even if you're undersized, to sort of use your body and contort it in such a way that you can always get a little bit of space in those mid-range areas. That's what I'm going to be looking for. It's not the shooting, it's not the defense, it's how well-rounded is he. I think the Rockets view Fred VanVleet as an ideal mentor for him for that reason, and well, others as well, but that's one of the leading reasons is Fred came into the NBA with a somewhat similar scouting report to Reed in terms of being developed as a shooter, as a scorer, and then he developed the floor general qualities over time. I think Reed as a shooter is going to be fine. It's the playmaking elements and the in-between elements. That's where I think even in Summer League, we can perhaps see some things that might encourage us heading into the fall. So those are sort of what I'm looking for. I think Reed Sheppard's the obvious headliner. And as far as things within Reed's game, it's the non-shooting elements, the point guard, the middies, those types of things. That's what I want to see the most out of Reed in whatever limited stint he has this year at Summer League. Paolo, anything else that you want to add as far as storylines you're watching for with Reed or anybody else on this very unusual 2025 Summer League roster?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it unusual. It just so happens when you're a winning team and you don't have that many prospects that are worth sporting in summer league. Yeah, yeah, I do agree with nearly everything you said. Although I'll be honest with you, I'm at a point where summer league is never going to show me anything that translates at all to the NBA. That's just no correlation whatsoever. I am tired of that. We saw Jabari Smith go off in summer league, and I thought, hey, maybe there's a ball hailing. No, like it. I refuse to be fooled. What I'm going into summer league with is I haven't watched Rockets basketball in a few months. I miss it. We have one player or two players that are rostered, or I guess three players that are rostered, but two on actual NBA deals that are going to play there. And I just want to watch them ball, sit back, and watch the ball go in the hoop because at the end of the day, that's what basketball is about. So that's what I want to see Reed do. I want to see him put up, I don't know, 25, 5 and 7, and just watch the ball go in the hoop and watch some watchable basketball because that's what I want to enjoy to try and, I guess, carry me over to October, which is way too long still. Like NBA, you need to fix this. And then besides that, I'll just point out that in the time we've been recording this podcast, obviously take this with a grain of salt because what else would he say? But Kelly Eco reported that Rockets Summer League head coach Garrett Jackson says he hopes to have second year guard Reed Sheppard available for the duration of their time in Vegas. That's the plan until I get told otherwise. So take it with a grain of salt. Obviously, probably wasn't gonna come out and say that Reed's not gonna play the entire thing, but if that's the plan, hopefully there's no injuries, and hopefully from the perspective that I was talking about just now, give me more games to watch the ball go through the hoop bit, and then I'll be a happy camper. So yeah, that's just where I'm going in doing. I'll just say one thing. Interesting point on the Moses Brown and Folly Danze double big thing. And it also makes sense from the perspective, and obviously this is pretty irrelevant, but it does make sense from the perspective that, well, you had to convince Moses Brown to sign here. He was probably one of the most sought after because he was a okay NBA big at one point with the Thunder. So, okay for Summer League standards. He's probably one of the biggest gets besides the two-way guys on the Summer League roster. So I think in order to get him to play for us, you probably had to say, hey, we're probably going to play a little bit of double big. Especially because there's basically no chance I'm not going to say the word, there's basically no chance that he gets a roster spot with us because we have so many bigs and we haven't followed Dante. So I do think that if we got him on the roster, it's probably because we promised him some playing time, and that probably comes through double bigs because obviously the Rockets prioritize the guy they have on a two-way in Polydante.
And yeah, this year's schedule shows the lack of excitement relative to previous years. You look at, and I'm pulling this up on Rockets.com right now, but the games are Friday, Sunday, Monday, and Thursday. 3 of them are NBA TV, the other ESPN2. 2 of them are afternoon starts on Sunday and Monday back-to-back. So this is a far cry from a couple of years ago when the Rockets and Blazers were the ESPN featured game, and it was Amen Thompson and Scoot Henderson, and Jabari Smith had that buzzer beater off the pass from Tari Eason. The Rockets are no longer a glamour team at NBA Summer League, and I think we're just fine with that. We've had our time in the spotlight the last few years with those young prospects. Now, this team is, as mentioned in the Cam Whitmore discussion, much more advanced than we thought they would be, further along in their contending cycle. That means Summer League doesn't matter. I'm happy that Summer League, for the most part, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I'll just, before we close, just get in that based on this Cooper flag they view Dallas versus Lakers, we can tell that Bronny James is actually the second coming of literal LeBron James because he's 3 for 3, 7 points. And Cooper flag is 4 for 11 as a 6'10" or 6 for 11 dude. So he's officially a bust. We're fine. We don't have, thank God Dallas trusted him because he's never going to be any good.
Terrible player, terrible prospect. Lakers got the big three between Luka, LeBron, and Bronny. Yeah.
Yeah, literally just missed the dunk. How are you 6 for 11 and you miss a dunk? Literally, just no point.
I'm a freshman watching this at 2 a.m. in Portugal, man. That's awesome. But to your point, it's the only basketball we will have for a very long time. So I guess you got to enjoy it while we can because we are about to hit the dead period of the NBA calendar. Anyway, that's enough for today, so I will wrap things right here. If you want more insight from me or Paolo before our next show, the best place to get it is on social media. I'm on there at Benjubos. Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA, Twitter, Blue Sky, all the usual places. And then on Twitter/X, if you hit up the logger line, that's where you can find this podcast. And if you go to the link tree in the bio, that's got all the information you could possibly need as far as the plugs we want to throw out. Subscribe to the show if you're not already, places like Apple, Google, and Spotify. Leave a positive review, hopefully a 5-star rating. That's how we can look good to friends, partners, sponsors like USA Today's Rockets Wire, like Carback Brewing, like Sports Talk 790. We want to keep this show going as one of those active ones covering Houston Rockets basketball. And with your subscription and your happy review, that helps us do that. And at that same link tree, you can find links to their content if you just want to hit up certainly USA Today's Rockets Wire, where I'll have daily coverage throughout Summer League. That's probably the best plug to throw out here because I'll have daily recaps as long as the Rockets are playing. Most likely 5 games, but possibility of a 6 if they somehow advance to the championship game like they did 2 years ago. That's how the 5th game would turn into 6 because 26 teams will have a consolation game added. 4 will go to the semifinals, and then the 2 teams that win the semifinals will have a 6th game, the championship, on Sunday, July 20th. So yeah, playing out over the next 10 days from Thursday the 10th through Sunday the 20th, and then we're officially in the void where all we have to look forward to is the reveal of the schedule in August. One thing I forgot to mention on today's show, we did learn the Rockets NBA Cup group, the Nuggets, Warriors, Blazers, and Spurs. A little bit of a tough draw simply because the last place team, it's randomized in that you have a team, from the top, middle, and bottom of the standings. And so everybody sort of gets a team that's within certain parameters. And so the 3 Western Conference groups. But the Rockets getting the Spurs as their last place group team is a little bit of a bad draw simply because the Spurs would not have been 34-48 if Victor Wembanyama had not had the blood clot. So a little bit of bad luck there, but you know what? I feel comfortable in saying that the Rockets are not focused on the NBA Cup this year. They're focused on the NBA Finals. And so with that, I'll bring this episode to a close. As always, I appreciate you guys so much for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes.